these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, folks. Today's topic is empathy. Why it's maybe good, why it's maybe bad, why maybe too much of it can lead to bad things. And we have an outstanding guest on the show today, someone who's a widely acknowledged expert in the field of psychology, renowned for uncovering psychological insights that impact our lives in countless ways. His research into moral psychology also has profound implications for politics and policy making, of course, which is what this podcast is about. So we're going to explore this topic, how it differs from rational compassion and how empathy often influences many of the major decisions we make as individuals and as a nation. So today we have Paul Bloom, Professor Paul Bloom, Dr. Paul Bloom. Thanks for being on.
Thanks. Just call me Paul.
Paul, I'm going to read a little bit about you, and then we'll jump right into it. So you're a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And also professor emeritus at Yale University. Study how children and adults make sense of the world with special focus on pleasure, morality, religion, fiction, and art. You've got a lot of awards for your research and teaching, past president for the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, written for scientific journals such as Nature and Science, New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and you've got 6 books out. So you're a busy man. Hey, thanks for being on this. I think this will be a really interesting conversation.
This should be fun. Thanks for having me here.
So let's just define our terms. I think it's probably the best way to start here. You write that empathy is related to, I think I'm quoting you here, empathy is related to compassion and concern. And sometimes those terms are used synonymously, but compassion and concerns are more diffuse than empathy. For instance, it's weird to talk about having empathy for the millions of victims of malaria, but perfectly normal to say you're concerned about them or feel compassion for them. So are we splitting hairs here, or what's the difference? How should we define these terms?
Yeah, I think, I wrote a book called Against Empathy, and you can imagine the email I got and the responses I got. And I think it is important to distinguish certain things, because when it comes to sort of answering the questions, how should we make moral decisions and wise decisions, the distinctions are important.
Yeah.
So people use the word empathy in different ways. You could talk in terms of caring about other people, just being nice, loving other people. And that's what I'd call compassion or concern. I think that's great. There's another sense of empathy, which means understanding what goes on in other people's heads, kind of perspective taking. And I think that that's something which good leaders have and good people have in general, but it's also something that terrible people have. Seducers and con men and all sorts of monstrous people are often very good at sussing out what goes on in other people's heads. The sense of empathy I'm most interested in, and a sense of empathy which I think is a little bit dangerous, is when you put yourself in another person's shoes and feel what they're feeling. And common sense says, that's great. That's what we should do. We should feel more empathy for other people. But I think it leads us into all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, it's funny. My wife is not just to see empathetic. She would be described as an empath. At least as laymen understand it. Maybe that has an actual clinical meaning. And I'm probably the opposite. So I'm just not good at that particular emotion.
You don't feel other people's pain automatically.
Not automatically.
No.
And one thing you did say struck me, which is, people use it to manipulate. I do see that in politics constantly, whether you call it, because look, it's people will be more persuaded by you if you develop some kind of emotional connection with them. Yeah. And what's the easiest way to do that is to tell them what they're feeling is what you feel. And just explicitly say that. You don't have to, politicians aren't necessarily telling the truth, but it's a fast track to that emotional connection, right?
Yeah, some of the best politicians are said, they take you by the hand, they use both their hands, they clasp them, they put your hand on your shoulder, and they tell you they just really get the way you are and what you're feeling, what you want. And they could be right. Some people are really good at sussing out other people. Yeah. That kind of understanding, which psychologists and I call perspective taking or mind reading, is very powerful. And again, if you're my friend and you want to make my life better, you figuring out what's in my head could be very useful. But right. if you're my enemy and you want to mess me up terribly, figuring out what's in my head is also useful.
Yeah. Okay. So again, for the layman out there, the difference between empathy and just compassion, or
Yeah.
how should we think about that?
So compassion is good. Compassion is caring about other people. I think we
Okay.
didn't have compassion, it'd be terrible. Empathy is putting yourself in another person's shoes and feeling what they feel. And the argument I would make is that empathy, people think it's good. People think it's the way to become a good person, but in many ways it isn't. It has all sorts of problems. And the real good people in the world, the good leaders, the good parents, the good friends, don't use empathy. They use
Mhm.
other things. If you use empathy, it makes you biased. It leads to burnout. It has all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and one of the points you make is that it makes people a bit myopic. So you're focused on, because you're feeling what someone else is feeling. This is like, it's nothing wrong with that, I guess, but it's easy to see how if you need to make decisions, you can't do that. And maybe that's why a lot of guys like me just have lost the emotion, because you have to make life and death decisions, and sometimes those have costs, and those can be very difficult. So you really have to stuff down that emotion if you're going to survive, which is maybe a good parallel to policy in some ways. If you're going, if the human race is to survive and make rational decisions, you do have to quell some of these highly volatile emotions.
I think that's right. People who like empathy often say it's like a spotlight. It zooms you in on somebody in trouble. And I think that that's right. But I also think that making good, wise policy decisions and good decisions in everyday life involve considering the fates of many people, considering often the fates of the group. You know, there's all sorts of times where there's a call to say, oh my God, this person's in trouble. Or take the current issue with regard to Ukraine, where there's people who are really suffering, and say, well, we got to act, we got to do something. But if you want to do the right thing and not just feel like you're doing the right thing, you have to sort of say, how's this going to affect people? Not just the people I'm focusing on now, but other people in the future, people in other countries, people in my own country. And it doesn't necessarily make you cold-blooded, but it gives you a broader perspective that empathy doesn't.
Yeah. And so is that what rational compassion is, by your definition?
So
because compassion you can have too much compassion too. I think Jordan Peterson brings this up, and whether we say the word empathy or compassion or whatever we're saying, a mother bear feels extreme compassion and protectiveness over her cub. And if she sees you, she will kill you. So that's kind of an overreaction. I mean, you're not going to do anything. She just murdered you. So obviously this can go too far, right? So rational compassion might be the right middle ground.
Sometimes people think that violence and cruelty are motivated by indifference and lack of emotion, but often they're motivated by exactly the mama bear sort of thing, where they're motivated by love. People who do terrible things to others in war, in life, are often motivated by intense love for those around them. And they're doing what they think is the right thing. So yeah, you could have too much compassion.
Is that and that's Steven Pinker's argument, right? That there's the world suffers from an extreme amount of more. He says morality, but maybe the right word would be moralizing, right?
He has this nice line. It's kind of crude, but I won't say it the way he says it. But if many people, if you're not caught up in a moral fervor, you're just kind of hanging around and being by yourself, not hurting anybody. That some of the people who cause the most trouble in the world are those who enter a sort of moral feeling that somewhere other people are doing bad things and they got to be punished. I mean, often a moralizing urge is a very punitive one.
So how is empathy short-sighted? How does it force us into these wrong-headed decisions?
So some of what I'm going to tell you is common sense, and some of it is sort of illustrated by scientific experiments. But who do you feel empathy for? Who do you care about? Who do you what are the people you put yourself in their shoes? Well, people who look like you.
Yeah.
People who speak your language, your neighbors, your friends, people who share your skin color.
Right.
There's a lot of laboratory studies saying that, white people are more empathic towards white people than the black people. We feel a lot of empathy towards good-looking people.
Yeah.
If somebody is ugly, if they don't speak your same language or different skin color, it's very hard to feel what they feel. It's very hard. And if you let empathy be your guide, you're going to be very biased and very narrow. When we reflect, and here's the sort of rational, here's the rational compassion part. You care about other people, but you might have principles. You might say, look, I don't care. Attractive people aren't more valuable than unattractive people. White people aren't more valuable than black people. And if you think this way, in this impartial way, you start to shed your emotion of empathy and do things in a different way. And sometimes you might end up doing good things that don't really fit your emotional pull. You might say, this to me doesn't feel like the right thing to do. I'm going to do it anyway because it is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and not doing it. So not acting in that way prevents us from thinking in the long term, which look, I relate that to politics quite often. There is what feels good, and there's certainly what feels good to tell people because it sounds right. And maybe that's playing on those emotions, playing on that sense of empathy. Like, what I see in politics is maybe more direct than that, which is somebody has some kind of misconception. And it's a popular misconception because it sounds right. There's so many things like this. Here's a recent example just from this past week, right? We can't spend money on aid to Ukraine because there's no baby formula on the shelves. Like, these things are not related even remotely. These are not remotely related. You can't solve baby formula problem by spending money. And even if you could, you can do both, right? You can solve both problems. So it hits hard. And I don't know if that has anything to do with our conversation about empathy.
It has a lot to do with it. My favorite example of the worst excess in empathy. I'm not a political historian, politician. I don't know when this started, but somewhere in the State of Union speeches, began this ritual where the president would point out somebody and say, "Oh, this person suffered. This person was wounded in war. This person didn't get the health care they deserved. This person," and tell a story about this person, and then say, "So you got to support my policy." But anybody could have found another person for whom things went differently.
Right.
And the moment in politics, which I hate, and I hope you've never indulged, is when when the politician reaches into his or her pocket, pulls it. Let me read you a letter by a 6-year-old who wrote to me.
Yeah, I've never done that.
The 6-year-old says, Obamacare was a big thing and it killed my little brother, or Obamacare saved my life, or whatever. And this stuff, politicians do this because it works, because telling individual stories, we get, if somebody said, if we do this, it will save 10,000 lives. Okay. But that doesn't grip me like a single story about a single person. And that's a fact about psychology, but it's an unfortunate fact.
Yeah, and like you can see it in all aspects. I'm sure it happens on the left and the right. I'm biased, so I see it happening more on the left. This especially this attraction to singular stories to convey a larger narrative. Look at the last couple of years. The COVID, right? Like there's somebody dying of COVID, so you all have to lock down. But you're like, wait a second, but they had these comorbidities. There's all these rational explanations for this particular thing. You can talk about it. Is the idea that police are systemically racist is another really big one. It caused a lot of death and destruction. This particular narrative.
I think for all of this, I agree with you totally. You should go to statistics. How many people die because of this? What happens because of this? What I'll tell you, I don't know if you disagree with this, is that both sides do it all the time. I'm on Twitter a lot, and I'm always hearing the guy say, I had this friend of mine, he took the vaccine, now he's dead, and his family are mourning.
The vaccine stuff is a lot.
It's always the stories you take, and there's often a power. You take like gun control, and a liberal will tell you a story about somebody, a horrible story about somebody who's killed by a gun that somebody had. A conservative will tell you a story about somebody who's defenseless against a violent criminal because the government took away her gun. Right. These stories are easy and they're worthless.
Yeah, they're worthless. You make a broader principled argument. And look, the example I gave about you can't aid Ukraine because of baby formula. I haven't actually heard that from the left. That's a right-wing one. Because I relate that to the populist right. To me, and this is what I say to my own side all the time, that I see very few differences between the populist right and liberals. In the end, it's all about your feelings in the moment and your anger and the politics of resentment. It's a very powerful message because people are frustrated. People are frustrated for a whole number of reasons, but if they can attach their frustration to something, some kind of cause, they feel some kind of purpose.
Whatever you think of Trump, and you can try to guess my own feelings as a liberal professor, but whatever you think of Trump, he was very good at this. He was very good at empathy, actually. Not himself. He was probably not the most empathic guy in the world, but he would tell stories about victims of crime, about he was a good storyteller. He got the crowd really caring about individual people, and wouldn't much use rationality or any sort of deep thinking to motivate his policies. It seemed to be driven by stories, and stories work.
They absolutely do. And he absolutely had the ability to tap into something. Let's talk about our ability to even make those kind of rational decisions. And you mentioned Jonathan Haidt in your research quite a bit. I've read his books, have him on the podcast. I think a phenomenal thinker, also studies moral psychology. He says we have pretty limited ability to control our own decision making. He talks about the rider and the elephant, and the rider is just trying to steer this big elephant, but the elephant's going to do what it wants, and that elephant is your subconscious, your emotions. How do you see that?
I'm a big fan of John, and there's a deep truth to it. And in particular, John says, I say this is the right thing to do, and I give this big argument for it. And what John would say is the argument isn't what's really driving me. My gut feelings are driving me. The argument is like a lawyer called in to defend a case.
Yeah.
And so much is post hoc rationalization, where people give these impassioned things, but basically they're defending either their own self-interest or the interest of their political party. Where I might disagree with John a bit is that I do think we can transcend this. I think we can think, we can reason our way out of it, particularly in communities of thoughtful people. And I'll shift here to somebody you mentioned before, Steve Pinker, and Steve has long championed the importance of rationality, how through deliberation and reasoning and thinking we can say, look, at a gut level, the people who look like me are more important than other people. But I can think about this. I can take the, try to imagine a neutral party, talk to other people, and then say, look, my prejudices feel right, but I'm going to override them. And I think a lot of people do this with regard to issues over gay people and trans people, and used to be interracial marriage, where they had strong gut feelings and say, but I gotta go where the arguments take me. So sometimes I think John Haidt is a bit pessimistic about our capacities.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to put it. And I'm not 100% familiar with Steven Pinker, but what's interesting about his book, Enlightenment Now, it's in one sense, it's very optimistic in our ability to rationalize our way to a better existence, which is largely true. Now, somebody in my position on the conservative right would also say that that's all well and good, but you also have to have a moral foundation. And that has to be consistent and absolute. And this is where our Christianity comes in, the Judeo-Christian values that I believe created Western civilization. I don't believe that. I mean, I think I can point to that very clearly, historically, that moral framework, whether you believe in God as a divine power or not, created that moral framework under which we live. Do you think that's important? I don't think Steven Pinker's, I think he's an atheist.
He is.
Yeah.
He is an atheist.
So and this would be a question I ask him, and curious what your thoughts on it. I mean, can we still rationalize our way to a better existence without a solid anchor in morality?
My answer might surprise you. No, I think we do need a solid anchor in morality. I think, you need to have moral principles. You need to care about other people. Maybe where you and I depart, and it's not so much over the historical question of the role Christianity or Judaism, other religions play in cultures, but in the question of the necessity of belief in God. So I can't imagine, maybe you disagree with this, but plainly there's people who are driven by powerful, sincere religious belief, and the worst people in the world who do monstrous, terrible things. And you may say they're corrupting their religion, but nonetheless, they're honestly religious. And then the world is filled with atheists, people who don't believe in God at all, who get their morality some other way. They might get their morality by just, taking human life seriously, caring what other people, wanting to be fair, wanting to be just.
So the question we always ask then is then how do you know what is moral? How do you know what is correct? Because if you don't believe in the higher power, there's no reason for you to agree with the Judeo-Christian moral framework. Now, again, we're kind of conditioned to, because our civilization was created on top of it, atheist or non-atheist. But if you don't have it, then how do you know what is even real? Which is why I do think, which is my argument for why belief is actually important. You got to be afraid of doing it wrong. At least you got to have the fear of God, right?
You got to be, I think to some extent, and good people tend to be moral realists. They tend to think there really is a fact of the matter. Some things really are wrong. It's not just we got together and said they're wrong. They really are wrong. But the question of how do you know is a question that bedevils the faithful as well as atheists. So you look at the Old Testament, you look at the Gospels, and there are parts in it where you'd say, wow, that's good stuff. I'm going to live my life on that. There's other parts, injunctions about slavery, the treatment of women, and so you may say, no, I don't buy that. That's not the core of religion. And so even religious people pick and choose. And when they pick and choose, they draw upon a moral sense. So a lot of my research suggests, and I'm not the first to say this, that separate from religion, people are born with some capacity to discern right and wrong. And when a religious person goes through the text and says, that makes sense, I'm going to buy that, that's valuable, and said that's nonsense, slavery, I don't care what they said, slavery is a bad idea, they're drawing upon that moral sense.
Yeah, I would disagree that the Bible says slavery is a good idea. It talks about it. It doesn't condemn it the way our modern minds would like it to condemn it. It was written in its time, right? The message from Jesus came in its time, and it can only come in that time and in that context. But I think we have to look holistically at scriptures to gain the true understanding of the moral framework that it's trying to impart.
I actually agree with that. I would just think the capacity to look holistically at scriptures requires in some way a moral sensibility that derives from sources other than scripture.
100%, that's true. The faithful would argue that God created our brains to work exactly like that.
Yeah.
And because this morality is discoverable because God lives within us. So that's the religious argument. Either way, like we all tend to agree on what's right and wrong. And it's an interesting thing that at least in Western civilization that anchors us. And there was another point I wanted to make on that. But we got real focused on the atheist versus non-atheist discussion. Maybe it'll come back to me. Your book touches on a related emotion, which is rage, which there's a lot of. Actually, I remember now what I was going to say, because you said something about religious people sometimes being the biggest mass murderers. And I would say, like, look, I absolutely understand that point too. Some of the worst commentary I see online directed at me, I'll go to this is really depressing. I go to their bio, every once in a while, not everybody, of course, but every once in a while, we want to see what's happening here.
Yeah.
And I swear to you, the thing that me and my wife see the most is in their bio, in their descriptions, it says something like Jesus first. Or only and it's really depressing because it's very unchristian like. And look, here's a related question. Are there always going to be people? This is a question I wrestle with a lot recently, whether it's political or religious or whatever it is. It's a very tribal feeling. Is there just always a section of humanity that is hardwired to believe that their priority should be rooting out heretics in their midst? It just seems that way on the left. It seems on the cancel culture left. It seems that way on the cancel culture right. You can find plenty of examples.
I mean, one answer to that is yeah, and the number's 100%. I mean, we all have the tendency.
Can't be all of us. Jeez, don't make it more depressing.
Well, it's a matter of degree, right? There are people on the right and the left, and on whatever group there is, who really want to literally kill the apostates, and have very low tolerance for disagreement. And then there's people, and I imagine both you and I like to see ourselves as such people, who are more open, who could say, look, I know you disagree with some fundamental tenets, but we can talk about it, and it doesn't make you a monster if you and I disagree. I think there's different things going on. Some of it's cultural. Some of it's sort of cultural ideas. There used to be more of a cultural feeling that you could sit down with somebody you disagree with. And now I think among a lot of my friends, actually, people say, if somebody disagrees with you over fundamental issues, you can't be friends with them. They're monsters, and you shouldn't approve of their being monsters. And I think I agree with John Haidt that that's a real negative thing that's happened in our culture.
And especially on college campuses, what's your experience? I haven't been on a college campus in a couple of years. And even then I was in a master's program. I'm just not sure that these problems are as prevalent in master's programs as they are in maybe undergrad programs. But what is your experience? How do you talk to students about this? how did students react to a book? It's called, because look, University of Toronto, I don't think there's a lot of conservative clubs.
No,
no. I'm not sure there's a lot of Dan Crenshaw. Is this where Jordan Peterson famously?
Jordan Peterson was actually in my department. He just resigned. I am in his office of all things.
Oh, really? Wow. So, you guys friends?
I don't know. No. We communicated about office furniture.
Yeah. Okay. You guys didn't really know each other.
No.
But what do you think about all that?
I think, and I have a lot of friends who are involved in movements about free speech on campus, particularly Greg Lukianoff, who's founded an organization on that.
Yep.
I think there are real problems that often crop up where people's views are sort of savagely shut down and people are punished for heretical views. But I'll also say that it's a lot more rare than you would believe from reading the left-wing papers and the right-wing papers. And there's an image, if you read the New York Times, you'd think, every 5 minutes I'm at my campus and some people are screaming at me that, you're gonna lose your job, whatever. And for the most part, I have talked to Yale students. I've been at Yale for like 22 years. I just moved to Toronto. For the most part, I've talked about all sorts of controversial stuff. We've argued about religion, about abortion, about different views on morality. My work is, if you study morality, you immediately get into some super controversial stuff, the definition of race, the definition of sex and gender. Almost without exception, I find the students engaged and interested and willing to argue and willing to cope with views that are not their own. And I try to teach my classes so the students don't know what side I'm on, whatever. But the sort of trouble you'd expect to find, I've never found it. At the same time, though, I think there's a very small proportion of people at college campuses, are mostly on the left, elsewhere they're mostly on the right, who are extraordinarily impermissive about views that conflict their own, and they want to punish people who present those views.
Yeah, and you're probably right. And I suppose that's good news. That it's nothing's ever as bad as it seems. And look, in the end, college kids just want to get drunk, and it's college. College kids at Yale, either they want to get drunk and party, or they want to get their economics degree and then go off to the hedge funds. They're not they're not necessarily want to do a Marxist overthrow of the country. They got other things, other fish to fry. Well, hopefully, I mean, the counter argument to that is we do hear about serious problems in corporations where this campus culture that we hear about seems to be very real in the corporate sector. Especially from HR departments, where they now have some authority and put a real, I think, suppression on free speech, free thought, free anything. And again, obviously depends on what the business you talk to, but it does seem like all large corporations deal with this to an exceptional degree. And it's a recent phenomenon. And a lot of people on the right probably said, these kids, they're going to get what's coming to them. They're going to go to the real world, and the real world's going to have a rude awakening for them. But they had a rude awakening for the real world. Yeah,
I think that's true. And I think in some way, what you see in corporations and HR is the worst of all of it. On the one hand, it's very illiberal. It tries to squash down, it tries to make life really unpleasant for people who don't toe the party line. And on the other hand, it's ineffectual. I think there are really good goals to have sometimes. And things like diversity training. You talk to 100 people who study diversity training and study social psychologists, they will tell you almost overwhelmingly it's nonsense, it's bogus. It's the way a company like Starbucks tries to enhance its reputation on the cheap. And a lot of stuff about implicit bias and everything has been corrupted and corroded by corporations, just in sort of ways so they could say to the world, look, we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's a checkbox. So I'd say it's interesting bringing up diversity training, and because related to that is unconscious bias, or this idea of unconscious bias, right? And I'm curious your perspective on that, because look, if you ask people very direct questions, you can find the evidence for unconscious bias. You've said yourself in the research that people feel more empathy for people who look like them. So some people take that fact, and it appears to be a fact, right? By all available metrics, it appears to be a fact. They take that and they say, see, systemic racism. This is why X, Y, and Z. Is that really rational compassion?
I think I think the question of unconscious bias is interesting. I think first thing, there's a lot of conscious bias that exists. You ask people, and a lot of people will tell you they don't like some ethnic group or another. And then there's unconscious bias. I think at a gut level, often we have these associations with certain groups that maybe shift you when you're choosing a doctor, or choosing a lawyer, or choosing who to talk to when you sit down to somebody. I think it's worth knowing. It's worth knowing because most of us want to be good and fair people. And so it's good for us to know sometimes we might do the wrong thing because of biases. I mean, here's a simple case to go back to an example, which is sort of less offensive to people, less politically charged. There's a powerful bias towards good-looking people. So if you're looking through a bunch of candidates, white, black, men, women, and they have pictures attached to them, whether you know it or not, you're going to be biased towards the more attractive people. Now, if you think that that's wrong, if you think the kind of job I'm doing, that shouldn't make any difference if someone has a scar on their face or someone weighs more than average, then you should sort of say, well, maybe I don't need the pictures. And so knowing about unconscious bias helps you figure out how to be just and fair in ways you want to be.
Yeah. And I think the mistake, though, is assuming that unconscious bias seriously affects behaviors, because in the end, we are a civilization that applies, as you mentioned earlier, applying principles to whatever biases you have is an important part of being civilized.
That'll work. I think that's totally right. And that goes back to the idea that we might have these gut biases driven by emotions, but we can get together as a community and figure out ways. Here's a way to choose somebody so that race doesn't get in the way. Here's the way to make a decision that our biases don't get in the way.
Your writing also touches on a very related emotion, which is rage. I see a lot of rage in politics today. People just looking for it. I don't know why this emotion is so popular. I'm not sure why you want to feel this way, but I've noticed after being in politics that people want to feel this way. Tell us about the psychological foundations of rage. It's got to serve some useful purpose. All of these things are so deeply embedded into our psyches, hardwired into our brains. I'm sure they all serve some psychological or some anthropological purpose. Yeah. You care about more people who look like you because that's what keeps your group safe when you have warring tribes, right? Which is the last tens of thousands of years of human existence. So, there's obviously some deep reasoning behind this. Tell us about rage, because I see a lot of that.
I think for every emotion, you could tell, and you should tell, an evolutionary account for it. Many of them are shared, but with other animals, particularly other primates, and they do work for us. It makes sense for us to be biased towards those who look like us, and draws us to members of our family and members of our tribe. It makes evolutionary sense. Only now we say, well, maybe that's kind of unfair. Guilt, shame, embarrassment, gratitude, they all have these carefully worked out evolutionary accounts. But then we go to the real world and how we want the real world to be. And we might say, yeah, but it's a lousy way to do it in a world full of billions of people, who interact the way we do. And rage is interesting. Anger is interesting. In some sense, anger is not all that bad. Anger is a paradigmatic moral emotion where often what makes you angry is injustice. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the great moral crusaders, I'll talk about Jesus Christ, weren't driven so much by empathy, but by anger. When they saw wrongness, it got them angry. Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. The theme of anger, righteous anger, is good and could be a powerful and important motivator. But then you get to rage, and there's something about rage which inherently the word is unhinged. And I think there's just too much rage in politics. And I think there's things going on, but one of them is that a lot of it's performative.
Yeah, I was going to say it's fake. It's all fake. Now, but it's not fake for the people. Like, that's the problem. It's fake for a lot. I think a lot of people just say things, comments on Twitter, and just because it's just a lot of it's young guys that are like, oh, this will be funny.
All caps, exclamation mark, and a good name, a good name there. Yeah.
Because for whatever reason, rage tweeting gets more engagement, which maybe speaks to a problem with social media. I don't know if it's a problem or a problem with the human condition. I don't know.
I mean, there are questions about social media, but you're right. There's been these big scale studies, and maybe the results aren't that surprising, but angry moralistic tweets get retweeted.
Right.
And so there's the whole problem with Twitter, which I'm on too much, but there's a positive feedback system that encourages nastiness and insularity and misunderstandings. A thoughtful response nobody cares about.
And is that a problem with Twitter, or is that a problem with us? I did some research into this for my book also, and one of the things I came across was finding the right words for captioning your title. So forget about tweeting. I'm talking about just op-eds or a news article, and the number one is this will make you feel X. This will make you feel mad. This will make you feel happy. Right. That is the number one way to get clicks. All right, everybody's like writing that down right now. Like, this is how I become the social media influencer I've always wanted to be. That's interesting.
Yeah. It's a problem with us. And this problem with us has been exploited by people, been used by people who create Twitter and Facebook and so on, because, and by people who want to be popular and demagogues and populists, but also people like you and me who sometimes want to have a really good tweet. And you're right. It's the takedown, the so-and-so destroyed somebody else. I have mixed feelings about Jordan Peterson, but one of the things I don't like about him is some of the videos that go about him is have him destroying these different people. And they're kind of irresistible to watch sometimes, but they speak to parts of us that I think we should be ashamed of.
To be fair, he's not the one captioning those. It's somebody else.
Okay, fair enough.
It's somebody else. And if you talk to Jordan, he hates conflict. He utterly hates conflict. He's an extremely agreeable person in a way that I am absolutely not. He's so much nicer than maybe some of that reputation would suggest. I want to talk about this. This is something I would have referenced if I'd seen this. I would have referenced it for my book because I have a whole chapter on this. Sweet spot. You wrote this book called Sweet Spot, and you write how suffering is not something to be avoided, but intentionally sought out as a means of pleasure and purpose. I don't know about the pleasure part. Maybe I'm thinking of different kind of suffering, but the purpose part, fundamentally agree with. Give us some examples of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, so I wrote Sweet Spot. I was just fascinated by when people seek out pain. And there I'm thinking about the pleasure part. Why do people have hot baths and spicy foods and sadomasochistic sex and all sorts of things?
Those are very different categories, to be fair. Spicy foods and sadomasochism.
you put them all together, you have a hell of an evening. But what draws us to this? How does that work? And I started writing about that. But my book was going to be called The Pleasures of Suffering. And then I started to sort of think deeply about it. And I still talk about them, but then I get into the stuff you're talking about, which is that I think people feel that a good life involves the right kind of suffering. And it has to be the right kind of suffering. If you suffer from chronic pain, there's nothing good to be said about that. It's not going to make you happy. It's not going to make you more fulfilled.
No.
But if you seek out difficulty and struggle and trouble and effort and often physical pain, everything from raising children to running a marathon, I don't know, doing a podcast, things, seems to involve, which are hard things that you don't have to do. We get value out of them.
Is there a physiological difference? Is there a study we can point to that shows something different happening in the brain? The same pain is happening, but somebody else is doing it versus I'm doing it.
As a matter of fact, there is. There's some lovely work. This is an old study by Kurt Gray and Dan Wagner. And the logic of it, I won't get into the whole details. The logic of it is that if you're feeling pain and you think it's just by an accident, it's because the computer's randomly shooting little electric shocks or something, it's not so bad. If you feel somebody is doing it because they don't like you, it hurts more.
Yeah.
And there's actually a laboratory demonstration where we sit you and me across from each other and we have a dial to shock each other. And the way the game is played is I shock you and you have to shock me back the same amount. But what happens is I shock you to a 2.
Yeah.
You say, man, that feels like a 3. Use that back to 3. I hit you for a 4. And before you know, we're both screaming. And there's a metaphor there, for conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Friends should try that at home. That sounds like a fun game. Is there a connection between suffering and morality?
Yeah, there's a deep connection in a few ways. One way is that we think that people who suffer that some suffering is good, is better.
Mhm.
There are these studies, and there's real world cases of this, where somebody who helps people and kind of likes it and has a good time, we don't respect that person as much as somebody who helps people and suffers. We take the suffering as having some sort of intrinsic value. I think another manifestation, which I often think about, is that sometimes suffering is the right thing to do, the right thing to feel. The writer Zadie Smith has this wonderful line that she saw on a condolence card.
Mhm.
It hurts as much as it's worth. And the idea is, if somebody you love dies, for instance, you should suffer, you should mourn. It would be wrong not to.
That's
Some
true.
things deserve some part of a moral response could be a suffering response.
But related to what you said too is the notion of sacrifice, to which we attach extremely large moral value. And
of course, religion, which we talked about before, in Christianity in particular, relates suffering of all sorts to morality. You might be accepting a lesson taught to you by God. You may be reliving the suffering of Christ, for instance, and it's something to be respected.
Right. It's fun. It's fundamental. I bring that up as well. What's interesting about ideas like this is that they've been true for a very long time. Whether you look at it from a psychological standpoint, you can kind of literally prove it, whether you find it, whether you discover it intuitively, or whether you read it in the Bible. It's been true for a very long time. Old ideas tend to have withstood the test of time. And I certainly think that's interesting. When people ask me what the greatest threat to our country is, I'm like, well, there's a lot. But one is this, that we have come to the conclusion in our society that suffering must be mitigated at all costs.
Yeah.
That's a very dangerous idea, in my opinion. What do you think?
I think you're right in a couple of things. These are very old ideas. My book doesn't pretend to be original in its claim of importance of suffering. You find it in the Bible, you find it in Buddhism. You tell a Buddhist, man, suffering is an important part of life, and it'll look at you like you're an idiot. Like, you're really telling me this? This is, or a Catholic, or Jew. This is old stuff, and I think it's been forgotten to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's sort of an ideology that people have on the left and the right. And sometimes it's meant cynically. Sometimes it's just something you got to buy into, which is all we care about is pleasure. All we care about is pleasure and status and avoiding pain. And that's all there is to be said about human nature. And I think this is a really pessimistic and mistaken view about people. What I try to do in my book is argue for what you call motivational pluralism, which is that we want a lot of things. So we do want pleasure. People, on a hot day, it's nice to have a cool beer. It's nice, all sorts of things feel good. But we also want to be good people. We want to make a difference in a positive way. And we want meaning. We want meaning and purpose and transcendence. We have many appetites.
Is this so we agree that there's a trend here where it's like, live your best life. The comforts of life are your number one priority. Leisure is your number one priority. Yeah. It's not work. And like if I talk to kind of, boomers who are managing people my age, or usually a little younger, I'm like an elder millennial, they'll often say, like, they have no desire to put in the extra hours, and there's no loyalty to the company. It's a very different working environment. I think you see this in the data too. Younger people just place a much greater value on leisure than older generations did. So this is a trend that we clearly see and can clearly observe. I wonder, is this related to the other trend we see, which is a heightened sense of anxiety, heightened mental health problems? Because how do people deal with the problems of life when they've sort of conditioned themselves to have a very low tolerance to suffering?
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions there about what's changed over time. I tend to think there's been a lot of positive trends in happiness and productivity and so on, but there definitely has been some negative trends. And this is even before COVID, which caused a lot of horrible things to happen. Angus Deaton talks about deaths of despair. And he points out, these are not kids. These are older white men.
Yeah.
And these are the group in America who are most likely to kill themselves, just kill themselves, or in some way probably indirectly kill themselves through alcohol, through drugs, through all sorts of things. And one thing which is going on here, I think, which connects to what we're talking about, is they don't have lives of meaning. They don't feel that they're doing stuff that's valuable and that gives them autonomy and gives them respect. And I feel that a good society gives you more than pleasure and a good time and even a good paycheck, but gives you a chance to work hard at something and feel the value. And, you know,
feel dignity.
Dignity, that's a good word. Dignity, autonomy. Tom Tyler, who studies workplace interaction, says the determinant of how happy you are in your work isn't so much how much you're getting paid. It's not how it's your leisure time, your vacation time. It's whether you feel you're treated with respect and treated fairly. Yeah. People put up with a lot if they feel that they're getting a fair deal.
And if they're part of something.
They're part of something.
And so it's easy to see how people can fall into these traps of despair, because sometimes it's just hard to have the perception that your job means something. Maybe it sucks. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe you hate your boss. Maybe you hate your coworkers. And it sucks.
And some jobs honestly suck. I mean, you know, some sort of Zen Buddhist could say, oh, you find satisfaction and richness in everywhere. But it's tough if your job is just a nonsense job where you're just shuffling papers and you're not making a difference.
Right. It's hard. I mean, sometimes I feel that way about my job. So, I mean, well, you know, you're a psychologist. How would you give us some therapy? What do you say to people who do feel like they're in this place of despair? Because like I kind of wrote about this in my book, but I'm not sure how deep we got, and it's not a therapy session for me, but I try to tell people you have to find. I mean, you just have to make the conscious choice to find meaning in everything you do, because it is a cog in the machine, and that machine is important, even if it doesn't feel like it at that moment. What's maybe even more important is the inherent value in improving yourself in some way every day, and being a productive member of society that is contributing more than they are taking. Does that give you, that should give you some sense of satisfaction? Again, I'm not sure that advice would work with everyone. Maybe you have a deeper one.
No, in some way, it's not a therapy problem. If somebody's miserable because maybe they're a cog in a machine, but the machine's not doing anything of value, mm-hmm. and they feel demeaned and they lack their dignity and nobody respects them, you know, in some way, I imagine a therapist could teach them how to cope and could tell them, look, your whole life isn't your job. You have other things. You have family. You have other pursuits to do. But in some way, such a person isn't doing anything wrong. They're in a situation that doesn't afford them the right chances, and the problem may be more solved that a way that to try to adjust society to give people more of a chance to flourish. But someone in that situation, I guess the most concrete thing I would say is that I think people in various jobs often try to say to themselves, what's the way I can make this the easiest and the quickest? Well, they should be to some extent saying, what's the way I can make this the most difficult and challenging?
Yeah, because good things are almost always achieved through something that is hard and challenging. And it gets to a conversation about politics. I mean, the fundamental goal of most people in politics is to improve the well-being of their constituents. And for conservatives, a huge part of that is dignity. Now, I think liberals would say basically the same thing. I think we have vastly different ways of getting to it, because I think you derive dignity through challenging yourself, the freedom to fail, the freedom to succeed to great lengths. And even if I could create that for you, I can't create that for you, which is also a key tenet of being a conservative. I think we're banging our heads against the wall trying to get government to create it for you. And this is where I think we depart from liberals. Liberals will say, look, we have to have a program of meaning, right? There's a ministry of what's it called? Oh, it's why can't I think of a ministry of loneliness in the UK? There's a person who's a minister of loneliness, and I don't know that government can solve loneliness, even though it's an important thing to solve.
It'd be a great thing to solve. I see what you're saying. I'm not sure there's as much of a chasm between liberals and conservatives here, because the idea of dignity, as you know, is a term often used by liberals with regard to the rights of ethnic minorities, regards of gay people, of trans people, and they're
the same language,
and there's the same language and same goals, and they're to some extent There's even a parallel strategy, which is to allow the government the rights of people to interact and live freely, to not put impediments upon one group of people that apply to another group. Now, there's sorry, go on.
No, finish your thought.
Like, there's always a figure ground. So somebody could say, look, the coming abortion battle is a battle about the dignity of women. And someone else who is, say, pro-life will respond in a very different way and see things very differently.
Yeah.
My point isn't so much who's right, it's that I think both sides see and acknowledge the importance of dignity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my side's clearly right. But
that short circuits a lot of conversation.
But no, I'm joking, not really. But I think what's interesting, I just like to look at I'm very interested in moral psychology and political psychology. I love examining the differences. If you listen to my podcast a lot, I love examining the differences between how the left and the right think. And as of late, how different factions of the right think, and I also distinguish different factions of the left. I think you're right. There's not a huge chasm between liberals and conservatives, but there is between progressives and even liberals and conservatives, because a classical liberal, which these days in America feels just like a conservative, a classical liberal will say, of course I care about dignity and injustice and equality. And by the way, here's how I define these things. I define injustice as you infringing on the rights, my inalienable rights. And then I define rights, and I define rights negatively as opposed to positive rights. And so, negative rights means you do not have the right to kill me. A positive right would be, I have a right to your services. So if you're a doctor, I have a right to your healthcare. And that's written down in Canada. Where you live, it's in the Constitution. It's a right, according to Canadians. Now, it doesn't mean it turns out that way, because in the end, you can't force the doctor to stay up 24 hours a day to see everybody when they want to be seen. So I don't believe that can be called a right. Is it a service I'd like to get to everybody? Yeah. And I'm working on that, by the way. I have different podcasts on that, but I don't view it as a right. And so one of the problems I see is we talk past each other because we've started to redefine words, especially the words equality and justice and rights. These are really important words, and classical liberals define them differently than the progressives do. And it becomes a sort of contest between, frankly, who's more empathetic, who cares the most. And it's hard to follow those conversations sometimes.
I think there's a lot to that. I think there are different conceptions, say, of fairness, and equality and rights, and often there are political differences in how people construe them. So, very crudely, you might have more emphasis among conservatives for equality of opportunity, while for liberals, equality of outcome. But I'll also notice something which is kind of recent, and I think you might agree with this, which is that particularly in the last 10 years, the extremes on the left and extremes on the right have converged in odd ways.
Oh yeah.
In attitudes towards race, there's only two types of Americans, I think, who are suspicious of interracial marriage, and they're extreme white supremacists and people on the extreme left.
100%. There's a really hilarious video on YouTube. This one is two comedians. One is labeled racist, and the other is labeled woke, and they're just like, they agree on things like that, and they're like best friends. It's hilarious, but it's also things that are funny are often funny because they hit a very serious element of truth. Here's another thing I'll say. I'll let you react to it. This is a thing I say in speeches quite often too. When I'm pointing out to people that wokeism and an obsession with victimhood plays out on the right. I don't think nearly as much as it plays out on the left, but it plays out with people on the right. So here's how this goes. I say something extremely provocative and crazy and insulting, and then people react to it. I show dismay when people react to it. I show indignation. Were you obsessed with me? As AOC would say, do you want to date me or something? And then I play the victim. I play the victim because of how you've reacted to my action. And then I use that victimhood as a club to wield against you, rhetorically speaking. And I'm like, look, I can think of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene does that. Right? Mm-hmm. This is her playbook. It's It's predictable. And then that club they wield usually comes in the form of a fundraising email. And that's just if a politician does it. I mean, I think it happens often in other characters as well. But the obsession with victimhood is a problem. Don't you think?
I think so. I think it's, what we call an obsession with victimhood often depends on who we think are legitimate versus illegitimate victims. A lot of people on the right talk about Christians around the world and in America being persecuted. And presumably people on the right won't say, well, there's an obsession with victimhood with you. And they say, no, they're real victims. We should take it seriously. So often we talk about a perspective of victimhood, the victimhood stance by people we think don't deserve. They aren't real victims. But I agree with you. I think that there's this weird market where two opposing groups kind of get rich off of it. So Green says some anti-Semitic weird comment. A lot of people get extremely outraged. She gets rich off the outrage. A lot of people get rich by pointing out, what she says. And the rest of us think the world is a lot worse place than it really is.
The exhausted majority, which is something Jonathan Haidt talks about a lot.
Yeah.
Because they poll people, they survey people, and they place people into categories accordingly. And it's a very disingenuous action, right? To play the victim card. And you're completely right in your definition of, I think that's an interesting definition of victimhood. It's an unwarranted victimhood, right? That's what we're mad about. Clearly there are victims. That's right. It goes without saying. It's good to correct myself on that.
I know people on the right who complain about a culture of victim, but now sometimes correctly. And then they say, I deserve more sympathy as a conservative white male. Why are people treating me so badly? And they'll do it in the same sentence, so, and it's not that they're wrong. It's just difficult to both hold that. It's something uncouth in saying, help me, I'm a victim, and then saying it yourself.
Yeah. And if you are going to say it, do it with rational compassion, rational thought.
Yeah.
And maybe some broad statistics. And maybe we'll end with that. We're going just past an hour now. Which is how can we be better? I mean, how are there some tools? Are there some tricks? Are there some mental exercises we can do to be more rational thinkers, to stuff down the rage and the outsized sense of empathy that you write about, just to treat each other a little bit better?
I think so. There's a book I recommend called The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef. And she talks about this, about how to become more sort of objective about your own political views. And she's a good person to have on your podcast. And gives these different strategies, like, trying to steel man other case, for instance, is an example where you and I are arguing about abortion. And then my task is to express your views in a way that you would listen and say, man, he has me dead on to rights. And then it could be useful. There's a lot of things like that. But I think the real answer is that rationality is best done in communities. Get people together, often of differing views, to hash out solutions. And that way, the sort of emotions and irrationalities get factored out. So juries are smart ways of thinking. Scientific labs are smart ways of thinking.
You made me think of another piece of advice, which is, seek out people who disagree with you, but not too much.
Yes, that's true.
It's good advice, right? Because if we're just on totally opposite ends of the spectrum, I'll just confirm that I'm like, I knew you people were crazy, because it's just the cat, it's too much daylight in between you. So you got to seek out people who kind of disagree.
No, there's laboratory research supporting it. One study brought together Israelis and Palestinians and got each, who were deep in a conflict, and got each one to express their side to another one. And when they were done, they hated each other even more, because each side said, I just explained to the other group how things were, and they still haven't changed their mind. And it's very frustrating. So conversations, you're right. Sometimes conversations don't make things better. They can make things worse.
Well, especially if both sides are making emotional pleas and talking past each other, and it gets to steel manning an argument. If you steel man the argument, you at least understand where they're coming from. You can still disagree with them, but you'll also be a better debater, because you're actually going to address the point. This is something I really try to do in politics. I'm going to address what you're saying directly. I don't like deflection. I will answer your question very directly. and agree with me or disagree with me. But it's important for honesty. And what's a shame is it gets me in trouble a lot. But that's
it would, and on your own side too.
Yeah. Well, cancel culture only exists on your own side.
That's right.
But in the end, I would hope, and I think that the truth does win out. Paul, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me on. It's a good note to end on. The truth will win out.
It is. So Paul Bloom, everybody, just came out with this book, Against Empathy.
Sweet Spot, actually.
Oh, Sweet Spot is the new one. Okay,
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I liked. Okay, so you know what? I couldn't have used it as a reference anyway if it just came out. So now I don't feel as bad. I'm very interested in that one. I'll grab that one too. Well, thanks, Paul. This was really interesting for our listeners. Appreciate it. Where can people find you if they follow you on Twitter or something?
On Twitter, I'm Paul Bloom at Yale, and I'm paulbloom.net as a webpage.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on. That was great.
Thank you.